Moment of truth. The president announces whether the U.S. is in or out of a global climate agreement. Contraceptive mandate. Religious liberty advocates are praising President Trump's proposed rule change. Russia probe. Former FBI Director James Comey will be headed to Capitol Hill. And a modern martyr. A new book tells the story of a priest murdered in Iraq. We hear from the author, his friend, and brother priest. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, June 1st, 2017. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. The president touted his economic achievements in a Rose Garden ceremony this afternoon, citing an increase of $3.3 billion in stock market value and an increase of 1 million private sector jobs. In order to protect American jobs, the president says he is keeping his campaign promise to remove the U.S. from the Paris Agreement on climate change. He's saying he was elected to represent Pittsburgh, not Paris. America joins Nicaragua and Syria in rejecting a deal to reduce carbon emissions and fight global warming. Correspondent Mark Irons was there for the president's remarks. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. No big surprises from President Trump today. The White House had said a withdrawal from the international climate agreement was likely, and although some suspense was built around today's announcement, the president followed through on his campaign pledge.
As of today, the United States will cease all implementation of the non-binding Paris Accord and the draconian financial and economic burdens the agreement imposes on our country.
President Trump said withdrawing from the accord is part of his solemn duty to protect America. He says we're getting out, but we will start to negotiate a new deal with terms that are fair to the United States.
Today, U.S. bishops urged the president to honor the Paris Agreement. A statement from Bishop Oscar Cantu of Las Cruces, chairman of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on International Justice and Peace, says USCCB is on record supporting prudent action to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. In letters to cabinet members Rex Tillerson, Steve Mnuchin, and General H.R. McMaster, Bishop Cantu went on to say the effects of climate change hurt the poor and vulnerable who, quote, disproportionately suffer from hurricanes, floods, droughts, famines, and water scarcities.
In the lead up to his decision, President Trump tweeted yesterday that he was still listening to a lot of people on both sides of this issue, and the fight played out within the administration. Chief strategist Steve Bannon and Scott Pruitt, the head of the EPA, favored leaving the Paris deal, while the president's influential daughter, Ivanka Trump, preferred staying. Lauren?
Mark, how will the president use this to promote his America First agenda?
Well, President Trump is looking for a better deal for American workers, particularly in the energy sector. His decision today echoes his March executive order, which took aim at the Clean Power Plan and other Obama-era climate regulations. Details are still to come on how the U.S. will exit the Paris Agreement, and it's expected to take years. But the president's actions today are bound to be well received by his political base. Lauren?
Correspondent Mark Irons at the White House. Thank you, Mark. The Vatican is weighing in on the president's decision. I sat down with the new head of the Department for Promoting Integral Human Development. This includes migrants, the sick, imprisoned, excluded, and marginalized. Cardinal Peter Turkson helped draft Pope Francis's encyclical on the environment.
The issue of climate at the end of the day must surpass national, regional, political considerations, because climate is a global common good. It's not something that one particular nation or country can say, I don't accept this, I don't accept that, because it's something that's not really limited to a particular nation. And would be great if, for example, if all heads of nations, or so very many heads of nations got together to see this problem and to appreciate for what it is.
Many world leaders vow to keep up the fight against global warming and urge President Trump to do the same. They're reaffirming their commitment to the Paris Agreement. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee joins us from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Some of America's closest allies say they're worried the U.S. will abandon all efforts to fight climate change and create a rift among those who have signed on to the agreement.
In Berlin today, German Chancellor Angela Merkel praising China's commitment to fight global warming. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, who was in Berlin for a visit, said protecting the environment is an international responsibility, a seeming slight to President Trump's plan to withdraw from the Paris Agreement.
For Europe, it is planet first.
Others, like at the European Union, are more explicit in their criticism of the president's decision. European Council President Donald Tusk tweeting, "Please don't change the political climate for the worse," while British Prime Minister Theresa May reaffirms her country's commitment to the climate deal.
And it was only at the G7 last week that I was making clear to President Trump, as were other leaders sitting around that table, the importance we attach to the Paris Agreement.
Boris Johnson, the UK's foreign secretary, says individual U.S. states have shown leadership in bringing down CO2 emissions.
I continue to lobby the U.S. At all levels to continue to take climate change extremely seriously and to show the leadership that America has shown in the past.
David Kreutzer with the Heritage Foundation pushes back against the critics. He says the president did consider his international partners, but believes the Paris Agreement is a job killer that will have no impact on climate change.
I think he clearly wanted to do it, has wanted to do it, but wanted to listen to other people and make it clear that he wasn't doing it without listening to them.
Kreutzer is also critical of China's vowing to fight climate change. He says China is the biggest emitter of CO2 right now, and he says they haven't made any major changes or make no plans to make major changes until 2030. Lauren?
Wyatt, is President Trump's decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement likely to impact other countries' push for clean energy?
No, Lauren, it's not likely, which is why some have been critical of the Paris Agreement. Around the world, countries are moving away from coal-fired power plants specifically and closer to wind and solar energy. And here in the U.S., individual states and companies are likely to continue to do the same. Lauren?
Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. President Trump backs down from his promise to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The White House insists this is just merely a delay, and President Trump is not abandoning the pledge. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he is disappointed. However, in a full statement, he added, "We appreciate today's expression of President Trump's friendship to Israel and his commitment to moving the embassy in the future." EWTN, the Little Sisters of the Poor, and many other groups might soon be able to opt out of President Obama's contraceptive mandate. Religious liberty advocates are praising a leaked draft of a rule change proposed by President Trump. Jason Calvi joins us from the Supreme Court tonight, where some of the cases against the mandate have been heard. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. For 5 years, Catholic colleges, archdioceses, and charities have fought against the HHS mandate. The proposed change would allow any employer with moral reasons to opt out of providing coverage for contraception, sterilization, and abortion-inducing drugs. Since he's been in office, President Trump has pledged to support one famous group of sisters who serve the elderly poor.
Incredible nuns.
Last month, President Trump vowing to protect the Little Sisters of the Poor who are fighting the contraceptive mandate.
No American should be forced to choose between the dictates of the federal government and the tenets of their faith.
Relief could come soon if the Trump administration's proposed rule change goes into effect. Lori Wyndham, an attorney with Beckett Law, which represents EWTN and the Little Sisters of the Poor, says it could prevent crushing fines.
We were really encouraged by the draft that came out yesterday because it would protect religious groups like the Little Sisters of the Poor.
The National Women's Law Center threatens to sue if the leaked draft becomes final, saying women are going to lose free birth control. But lawyers representing some of the groups challenging the mandate say that's not true.
As the rule's preamble points out, there are plenty of mechanisms in place for women to have access to contraceptives if they want them. There are plenty of programs that the federal government operates to provide them free to women who are in the lower income scale.
The Obama administration did give exemptions to grandfathered health care plans and houses of worship, but not religious nonprofits. This new draft would expand that exemption to any group with religious or moral reasons for opposing the mandate. It would include the March for Life, the Little Sisters, and our network. The White House refuses to comment and calls the document first published by Vox an alleged draft. But the government is reviewing a rule change on preventive services where the HHS mandate falls. Lauren?
So if the leaked draft does go into effect, what happens?
Organizations like the Little Sisters would not need to file any special paperwork. The regulation would go into effect as soon as it's published in the Federal Register. Beckett Law says they still want the cases to be settled in court, so their organizations would be protected if the next administration decides to scrap the regulation.
Jason Calvi reporting tonight from the Supreme Court. Thank you, Jason. 1 week from today, that's when former FBI Director James Comey will testify on Capitol Hill, marking his first public comments since President Trump fired him. The Senate Intelligence Committee plans to ask Comey about Russian interference in last year's election, and they hope his testimony will answer questions that have arisen since his sudden firing last month. Comey will first testify in an open session, then behind closed doors. Russian President Vladimir Putin says while some patriotic Russians may have engaged in computer hacking, the Russian government has never done it. Speaking at a meeting with senior editors of leading international news agencies, Putin scoffed at allegations hackers could influence the outcome of the elections in the United States or Europe. The Russian leader added his country is misunderstood and is a victim of what he calls Russophobia. A developing story in the Philippines. Gunfire and explosions reported inside a hotel near Manila. These are pictures taken inside the Resorts World Manila complex in Newport City. Police, firefighters, and SWAT teams responded to the area. Investigators are still determining exactly what happened. The Philippines has been grappling with terrorism, especially in the southern part of the country. President Trump today said he is closely following the developments. And the head of the Coptic Orthodox Church in the United Kingdom has a surprising message for terrorists. It comes after recent terror attacks in Egypt and around the world. Bishop Angelos writes, "The violent and deadly crimes you perpetrate are abhorrent and detestable, but you are loved by God, your Creator, for He created you in His image and according to His likeness, and placed you on this earth for much greater things." A young Iraqi priest who was martyred 10 years ago for refusing to convert to Islam has become a symbol of perseverance for Christians in the war-torn country. Father Rashid Eid was gunned down in front of his parish after Sunday Mass on June 3, 2007. His story is captured by this new book by his former student and fellow Iraqi priest. Vatican correspondent Mary Shovelin joins us from Rome. Mary, what led to Father Rashid's death?
Lauren, this Saturday will mark 10 years since Father Eid, after celebrating Sunday Mass in the Holy Spirit Cathedral there in Mosul, where he was a parish priest, walking out of that Mass accompanied by 3 deacons who were accompanying him, Lauren, because of the various threats that Father had received on his life. As they were leaving the church, unknown gunmen presented themselves to the 4 men, and they hollered out to Father Eid and said, "We thought we told you to close this church." Father Eid just turned to them and said, "How could I close the house of God?" Those unknown gunmen then proceeded to kill all 4 men there on the spot.
I understand you knew him. What was he like?
Lauren, I have known saints. I was blessed to have met St. John Paul II, St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, but you never think that you're going to know a martyr. Father Eid and I studied at the Angelicum University here in Rome and the Pontifical University of St. Thomas. We were there at the same time. I didn't know him that well, but we all knew him, of course. We knew him for his profound joy, a true joy, Lauren. It was no surprise that he wanted to go home to Iraq as soon as he could after his studies. It was no surprise as well that he endured as long as he did, that daily martyrdom, the 5 years of threats and persecutions that he had to endure before that final martyrdom 10 years ago.
The book about Father Eid is being published at a time when Christians in Iraq are still being persecuted for their faith. And you talked to the author about the current conditions on the ground there. What does he say needs to be done?
Lauren, Father Reboir Baza, who wrote this book, is really reflecting on the situation in his own country right now in light of Father Eid's story. What they're asking, he said, Christians in Iraq are asking the U.S., the UN, Europe, the whole world to reflect on human rights and religious freedom. Here's part of our conversation.
If there are these rights, the religious freedom and other kind of freedoms, I think everybody can live his faith as he like, and we can live in peace, and this would be a great richness for Iraq and for the whole region and for the whole world.
Lauren, he said both Christians and Muslims just want to live their faith, and that their differences is something that should enrich them, enrich each other, and not divide them.
And Mary, that's exactly what we saw when our team went to Iraq. Thank you so much. Mary Shovlin, EWTN News Nightly Vatican correspondent.
Thank you, Lauren.
Pope Francis says demographics, migration, employment, and education are the many challenges facing families today in Europe.
4 crisi specialmente attraversano l'Europa in questo momento.
The Holy Father spoke to a gathering of European Catholic family associations. He stressed these crises could have a positive outcome if people work together to make policies that support families. Francis also encouraged families to defend the right to life of the unborn and ensure dignified living conditions for the elderly. A new gift for the Vatican this week. Pope Francis was given an electric car by manufacturer Opel. It was part of a conference taking place at the Vatican on the Pope's Laudato Si letter. The Vatican has pledged to make the microstate the world's first carbon-free country. Coming up, Christian persecution. Columnist Cal Thomas tells us why the issue isn't getting more attention. And it's picture day at the Supreme Court. Pope Francis says St. Paul is a model for all Christians.
Questo annunciatore senza fine di orizzonte, sempre di più.
During his homily Mass this morning, the Holy Father described St. Paul as a man of action, saying his passion for preaching and prayer can be an inspiration to all. Speaking of inspirations, our next guest has reported from around the world and witnessed how religious leaders practice their faith even when they're under attack. Joining us now, Cal Thomas, author, syndicated columnist, who's been covering Washington for a while and has been to the Middle East 20 different times. Do you believe, Cal, that Christian persecution and the refugee crisis is receiving the proper amount of immediate attention?
No, it's not, Lauren. All the attention seems to be on Muslims, which is fine to a certain extent, but the Christians are being persecuted in record numbers, not only in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world as well. It was always a bother to me that President Obama, who was a declared Christian, let in from Syria mostly Muslim refugees and hardly any Christian ones. And anybody who pays any attention to what's going on in the Middle East knows that the Christians, from the Copts who were murdered on this bus in Egypt the other day, to all kinds of other places, are being driven out of the Middle East, in Iraq and so many other places.
We've reported about that. A team of us went and saw just the decimation of these villages. But let's move on to sort of solutions of this. The country of Hungary donated $525,000 to help refugees. They donated it right to the church, St. Joseph's, where Archbishop Warda is in Iraq, where we spent some time. And I think that's what their solution is to closing their borders, is to give money to these refugees. Is that something that's sustainable for all countries?
I think it's part of the solution, but unless you create an atmosphere where people can live in peace and you have a government that practices religious pluralism, tolerance, equal rights for women, freedom of the press, free elections, then you're going to perpetuate the problem. It's like pouring money down an empty hole. But I think it is part of the problem. I think we in the United States and in Hungary and in other free countries need to encourage these nations that have these refugee problems, and terrorism is fomented, to create zones where they're able to live safely and don't feel they need to flee. That's the best and most humanitarian and compassionate approach, I think.
That's what the group In Defense of Christians believes. These safe zones are what can actually stop this horrific fleeing. You've reported on the persecution of Jewish people during the Soviet Union. What can Americans learn from history?
Well, I think Christians especially are not united as our Jewish friends were during this period in the 1980s, got behind what were then called the refuseniks, people like Anatoly, now Natan Sharansky, Vladimir Shlepak, and others who I've met. And They prayed and they lobbied and they had relatives. I interviewed Sharansky's wife several times here in Washington. She was tireless in advocating for her husband's release, and it finally worked with government pressure, with church pressure, with pressure from our Jewish friends. The Christian community is not as united as that. We are divided from denominations and even within denominations, left, right, literalists, modernists, Orthodox, Reformed, all these things. And I think that lack of unity harms our power to help our fellow believers in other countries.
Interesting observation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always
Cal
a pleasure.
Thomas, an author and syndicated columnist. It's photo day at the Supreme Court. The justices gathered for an official group picture, which includes the newest associate, Neil Gorsuch. All 9 justices posed in Washington today in front of the iconic red curtain. It is the first official portrait to feature President Trump's pick to the High Court. Justice Gorsuch was sworn in on April 10th. Up next, the evolution of Planned Parenthood. And we'll take you to the catacombs below Rome, where a new discovery has been made. Today, the church honors the early Christian philosopher St. Justin Martyr, born around the year 100. Justin became interested in philosophy at a young age. He was baptized around the age of 30 and was killed because of his faith. David Daleidon's undercover videos reveal the inner workings of the abortion industry. Last week, I spoke with an expert on the issue, the woman who wrote the book about Planned Parenthood's founder, Margaret Sanger. Joining us now is Angela Franks, author of Margaret Sanger's Eugenics Legacy, The Control of Female Fertility. Thanks for coming back to the program.
Glad to have it.
You looked at these David Daleidon videos. What do you think?
Well, it reveals the hidden face of Planned Parenthood that many of us suspected was always there, but we just never had the evidence.
What in particular distressed you?
The attitude toward the unborn child, which is very utilitarian, very recognizing that this is a person, and yet being willing to sacrifice this person for money, for this idea of choice.
The thing that got me were I pulled off one leg and then I pulled off another, and boy, the cracked skull is really sharp. I mean, those were some of the things where I just had this visceral reaction, and I'm sure you did.
Yeah, it shows that Planned Parenthood knows what's going on with abortion, but that's not what they tell everyone. And that's just how Planned Parenthood operates, that there's this hidden side to abortion that they don't want anyone to see because it is about cracked skulls.
Well, let's talk about the history, right? So these allegations of Planned Parenthood selling body parts, how did all of this begin?
The videos are these undercover videos where they're portraying themselves as being involved in this business of selling fetal parts to researchers. And there's been suspicions that Planned Parenthood was actually getting revenue from this over and above covering expenses, but we never had the evidence.
And I think that is still being decided in the courts. It is something that is not, I think that Planned Parenthood would deeply disagree with. How do you think Planned Parenthood is going to evolve in the coming years, particularly in this current political environment?
Well, Planned Parenthood has proven itself to be very nimble. Planned Parenthood is happy to change its name, change its public face in order to meet the circumstances. So I suspect Planned Parenthood will find a way to survive, but the more we're there to say this is what's really going on behind the shiny public facade, the harder it is for Planned Parenthood to be able to do that.
Angela Franks, author of Margaret Sanger's Eugenics Legacy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for being here.
Finally, tonight, we take you into the catacombs in Rome, where the first Christians were buried. Thanks to laser beams, we are now seeing ancient frescoes hidden inside. After decades of delays, restorers unveiled 2 areas of the Domitilla Catacombs' 7-mile labyrinth. The lasers peeled back history, showing frescoes from both pagan mythology and Christianity. The art dates back to the 3rd century, and organizers hope to open a museum by the end of the month to show the public the vast archaeological site. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, I'm Lauren Ashburn. Don't forget, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you again tomorrow. Good night, and God bless.